A Russian troop transport just got obliterated by a Ukrainian FPV drone over in Lyman. But trust me, that hit was just the opening salvo. It triggered a chain of events far more brutal than just another burning wreck smoking on the battlefield. This was an escalation. Because right after that drone strike, intel across the front line showed this was no isolated ambush. Every single Russian movement that followed, every push forward, even the armor meant to keep their infantry breathing, fell victim to this exact same relentless pattern of aerial pursuit. As the kill zone widened, we stopped asking how that first transport went down. The real tactical question became, what just happened in the Lyman sector that turned the whole grid into a death trap for incoming convoys? Stick with military force. Let's break down the intel. The ground truth in Lyman is that the threat no longer starts at the contact line. The entire approach route has become a bloody kinetic gauntlet. Ukrainian drone operators are systematically hunting and wiping out supply vehicles like UAZ vans, bukhankas, civilian cars, and dirt bikes. The enemy is using all of these just to rush troops and gear toward the trenches. Sure, these aren't the heavy armor or million-dollar assets, but tactically, they are the lifeline. They haul the ammo, fuel, rations, and fresh boots needed to reinforce squads getting hammered on the front. That is exactly why blowing them up cripples the enemy far more than it seems. A beat-up supply van might look completely harmless, but in a meat grinder like this, it is the only bridge between rear logistics and the infantry dying in the mud. Snap that logistical link, and the operational bleeding starts fast. Frontline troops get starved of ammo, and the combat pressure on the guys holding the line becomes absolutely crushing. So every smoking chassis we see isn't just a localized tactical win. It proves that Ukrainian units are actively turning every single access road into a merciless kill zone. This escalation gives the Lyman sector a strategic weight beyond random hits. The constant shredding of transport columns tells us Ukrainian drone pilots aren't just reacting to targets of opportunity anymore. They are actively shaping the battle space. They are making the mere act of moving a fatal mistake. Even dirt bikes, normally chosen because they are cheap, lightning fast, and can weave through the trees, are failing to keep guys alive. A courier might think max throttle will save his skin, but once a spotter drone locks on, that speed just leaves a massive dust trail to track. This completely rewrites how mobility works in combat. The core problem isn't whether Russian commanders can scrape together enough firepower and bodies for an assault. The real tactical nightmare is whether they can deploy them without getting painted, tracked, and blasted to pieces before they even reach the staging area. Lyman doesn't even look like a traditional front anymore. It is a massive, expanding grid where every single road and tree line is under lethal observation. Let's think tactically. A battlefield that brutally punishes every movement does much more than just wreck trucks. It paralyzes command decisions, shatters assault timing, and forces squads to burn all their energy just surviving the commute to the fight. And when the lightest, fastest transports get chewed up on sight, we have to ask a much darker question. Can any ground unit actually stay hidden from the sky? The intel coming out of Lyman doesn't just show us how suicidal movement is, it shows how totally impossible it is for Russian platoons to vanish once they dig in. For decades, infantry survival relied on basic fieldcraft. You stay quiet, grab some heavy cover, throw down camo nets, and hope you go unseen. A tank under a tarp, a trench masked by pine branches, or a squad sleeping in the woods could rely on the fog of war. That old-school assumption is completely dead. Ukrainian recon birds don't just stare at the map from one static angle. They return, orbit, and relentlessly scan the exact same tactical grid squares over and over. That persistent surveillance changes the whole war. A concealed dugout doesn't just need to fool an infantryman's eyes anymore. It has to beat thermal optics from 1,000 feet up, day after day, where one trampled bush equals death. The brutal reality we see is that camo fails not because the target is completely exposed, but because the terrain right around it starts looking out of place. Listen up, here's the current intel. Drone operators easily spot tree cover gaps, fresh tracks, churned earth, crushed grass, and colors clashing with the terrain. A vehicle might sit partly hidden, but the broken terrain pattern around it screams its location. Throwing branches over metal armor might look highly convincing to infantry on the ground, But from the air, it looks far too ordered, dense, and completely isolated from natural brush nearby. Even empty space is a target indicator. If a forest edge reveals a sudden break in its natural rhythm, that anomaly alone draws an immediate artillery strike. This means tactical camouflage isn't just about throwing a net over a heavy object anymore. It is strictly judged by whether it masks the tracks your unit leaves behind. That is exactly why passive concealment is utterly dead on a drone-dominated modern battlefield. In earlier phases of this conflict, a unit that halted and stayed totally quiet massively increased its survival odds. Now, dead stillness only buys time for the enemy observer. If a drone crew suspects your position is active, staying pinned down just gives them more time to confirm the kill zone. This creates a brutal new combat reality for ground troops. Cutting the engine and holding your breath won't save you. The enemy is reading the battlefield like a forensic crime scene. A fresh tire track leading into the brush, a tarp catching sunlight, or any shape that doesn't belong instantly, triggers a second look from above. Once relentless aerial surveillance starts, that old military hope of lying low until the threat passes becomes practically a suicide mission. Let's look at what this means together. Tactical concealment isn't a one-time setup anymore. It is a punishing, non-stop discipline, starting before arrival and lasting forever. Frontline soldiers now must obsess not only over what physically covers them, but over the distinct traces they leave, the brutal duration of their exposure, and whether their very presence slowly degrades the terrain. This is a massive shift in frontline combat survival. Every slight pause, every rushed shortcut, and every careless footprint becomes lethal evidence from above. The lineman front is proving that standard fieldcraft, while vital, is nowhere near enough when the sky is constantly hunting you. The kill chain isn't just targeting obvious armor in open terrain. It strikes locations that once felt totally secure for careful and patient frontline infantry squads. That is exactly what makes this combat phase so devastating. And if daylight can't shield platoons trying to vanish into the terrain, the next tactical question we face is completely terrifying. What happens when the pitch black loses its ancient power to protect them? Nighttime on the lineman front isn't a natural shield for our forces anymore. Russian thermal drones are actively turning total darkness into a lethal, overwhelming advantage for the side doing the hunting. For decades, military commanders treated the hours right after sunset as a tactical period, where visibility dropped, letting units move with a solid chance of dodging observation. That old military assumption is completely dead. A drone running thermal optics absolutely does not need daylight to hunt. It simply requires heat, contrast, and a few seconds to scan the grid. That entirely rewrites nighttime frontline troop movement. A supply truck, tactical van, or assault motorcycle that looks completely invisible to human eyes blazes like a beacon on thermal screens if the engine runs hot. Often, sheer movement guarantees detection. A traveling heat signature draws a strike team's attention far faster than a cold, static target. This changes the war entirely. Darkness used to strip away the absolute worst danger in ground combat, getting spotted and lit up before reaching your rally point. Now, the exact opposite happens out there. At 0 dark 30, the battlefield goes visually simpler. This helps enemy thermal scopes lock onto the only heat signature that actually matters. Intense engine heat sharply separates a vehicle from the freezing mud. The night is completely failing to hide our armor deployments in the old way. Instead, the blackness strips away distractions, making our convoys violently easy to target. A combat vehicle driver might assume nighttime travel lowers his risk, but the revving engine, the heavy exhaust, and friction from the tracks paint a glowing thermal signature, trailing his vehicle the entire route. What you and I used to call reliable concealment is now just a fatal exposure window the enemy is dying to exploit. The longer that supply route, the higher the casualty rate. Listen up. The tactical fallout goes way beyond one destroyed Russian vehicle. When safe transit windows collapse, the brutal reality fractures the entire logistics grid feeding the front lines. Combat resupply stalls out. Rotating battered infantry squads becomes an absolute nightmare. Medical exfiltration turns deadly exactly when bleeding soldiers need rapid transport the most. Moving casualties under the cloak of night used to work. Now, the rescue transport itself acts like a massive thermal flare drawing immediate enemy fire. This exact kill chain applies to ammo drops, water, fuel, and replacement armor. It lacks the glory of an assault, but survival depends on these daily runs. With the day and night cycle offering zero cover, every single convoy demands extreme caution and pure luck. This piles massive strain on frontline troops, already clinging to exposed trenches, forcing them into a brutal grinding war. A minor logistics delay can trigger absolute catastrophic failure. This tactical shift in night ops hits the operational level hard, not just visuals. Ground commanders can forget about using the dark to hide their troop movements. Now they must calculate thermal signatures, engine heat, and whether a quick dash down a dirt road lights up an enemy drone feed. Nighttime mission planning is now a ruthless test of unit discipline, not just checking a clock. Armored vehicles halt longer, creep shorter distances, or just eat the risk when a critical frontline task cannot wait. The Lyman sector proves the combat zone offers zero sanctuary to forces hiding from the sun. When neither thick terrain nor dead night masks a target, the evolution of unmanned aerial warfare enters a darker phase. We are watching a tactical pivot. Operators aren't just hunting moving armor, they are setting traps. Let's break this down. Ukrainian drone pilots around Lyman are no longer flying reactive strike missions against random movement, because they are actively preparing lethal kill zones and brutal ambushes before the target even rolls up. This escalation is massive. It entirely rewrites where battlefield threats emerge and when the ambush triggers. In standard drone operations, a pilot spots a hostile patrol, engages, and attacks on sight. In these new deliberate ambushes, the drone is already loitering. The Russian target blindly rolls into a pre-planned kill box. This completely flips the combat dynamic. Tactical success no longer hinges on mere reflexes from a drone crew. It requires cold patience, deep planning, and predicting exactly where Russian infantry or light transports will funnel through the terrain. This transforms dirt roads, tree lines, and approach vectors into absolute death traps for advancing units. The shock factor multiplies. Hostiles aren't getting wiped out simply because they reacted too slow to a threat. They die because they drove straight into a snare built around their own habits. It creates suffocating combat pressure. A reactive strike tells an infantryman he was spotted and hit. A drone ambush whispers something far darker. The lethal threat is already waiting, even beneath a totally quiet sky. This shatters how troops view movement. A transport driver or frontline squad cannot assume the zone is secure just because their airspace looks clear right now. The true danger lies 50 meters ahead, parked near a tree line alongside a supply route they've driven a dozen times. Unmanned warfare is rapidly shifting from reactive skirmishes to highly deliberate, calculated strikes. Ukrainian forces are actively shaping the theater, predicting Russian logistics patterns, and dropping the hammer right where those routes become painfully vulnerable. The true strategic value here isn't just counting the burning armor pieces at the end of a shift. Its true power lies in forcing massive behavioral shifts across the entire combat sector. Once enemy squads realize a drone ambush is waiting, every single transit route feels like suicide. Every checkpoint turns into a nerve-shredding nightmare. Every patrol demands extreme caution, bleeding the clock with paranoia. That psychological friction kills operational tempo. It forces platoons to spend hours dodging ghosts instead of executing the mission they were given. That's why you and I are tracking Lyman. It's more than drone strikes. Listen up. You and I are watching drone warfare enter a brutal new phase. Timing the kill zone is now just as critical as raw firepower. The objective isn't just punishing exposed enemy movement after it kicks off anymore. It is about predicting that movement before engines even start, striking when the target is completely defenseless. And once drone ambushes are executed with that kind of lethal intent, the whole tactical purpose begins to escalate. We aren't just looking at smoking one transport vehicle at a time anymore. It is about shattering the entire logistical rhythm, keeping rear echelon forces alive. The biggest takeaway out of Lyman isn't just watching Russian supply trucks burn. It is that these tactical strikes are directly hitting the system, keeping frontline infantry breathing. A flatbed hauling timber, boards, or building materials might look less critical than heavy armor. But destroying that cargo shapes the battlefield in brutal, long-lasting ways. When those supplies never show up, defensive lines sit unfinished. Trenches remain dangerously weak, and the dugouts meant to shield troops from heavy artillery and drones stay half-built. That means a single precise hit destroys not just the transport, but the future combat strength of the very stronghold it was supplying. That exact same logic hits resupply convoys hauling ammo, water, fuel, batteries, rations, and spare parts. These are the critical assets keeping operators lethal under fire. Starve them of gear, and even a standing platoon rapidly loses all combat effectiveness. The second a supply truck burns, the damage goes way beyond the flaming wreckage on the asphalt. The squad waiting up ahead just lost their defensive ammo, their generator fuel, radio batteries, thermal optics, and the basic survival gear required to hold that position for one more day. In a heavy combat zone, minor shortages never stay minor for very long. One delayed drop blinds forward observation, chokes comms, and wrecks fire discipline, forcing grunts to ration gear that should have been there. The pressure gets infinitely worse when actual troop transports take a direct hit. A truck packed with fresh reinforcements is the lifeline that lets exhausted, combat-fatigued operators finally rotate off the line, sliding fresh boots into the fight so vulnerable trenches stay manned without crumbling under sheer exhaustion. If you sever that rotation, those same battered men are forced to hold the line longer, zero rest, zero backup, when the next major assault hits. That breeds tactical weakness right before the enemy charges. Here is where it gets critical. Let's look at why wiping out these support convoys in Lyman is much bigger than isolated tactical wins. It exposes a massive Ukrainian operation to deliberately sever the supply chain miles behind the actual zero line. The objective is not just blindly blowing up whatever happens to roll down a dirt road. The lethal purpose here is strangling the vital flow connecting rear staging areas to the men dying in those forward trenches. Cut that supply bleed, and operations stall. Urgent armor repairs fail. Crucial defensive structures are totally abandoned, and entire battalions lose the operational rhythm required to survive under heavy, sustained combat pressure. One gutted truck suddenly triggers catastrophic ripple effects way beyond its payload or price tag. It leaves vital crates stranded, ruins troop rotations, forces panicked commanders to improvise, and breaks the backs of frontline infantry already taking fire. That cascading failure is what makes these drone strikes devastating. They are actively destroying the daily mechanics of movement, supply, and reinforcement, keeping Russian invasion forces standing week after week. And when frontline logistics begin to choke out like that, the relentless tactical pressure from Ukrainian drone units ignores standard supply routes, immediately shifting onto the heavy assets keeping the broader frontline intact. What is truly wild right now is seeing Ukrainian drone operators aggressively ignoring those standard vehicle targets moving along the contested zero line, because they are actively hunting the massive weapon systems keeping Russia's wider battlefield operations alive. The biggest indicator of this tactical shift is the surge of drone strikes wiping out Russian artillery. These hits are game-ending because artillery shields infantry, pins down enemy positions, and anchors Russian forces when movement gets lethal. When drones start spotting big guns hidden under cover, heavy netting, or dense camouflage, it shatters the myth that artillery is perfectly safe just sitting miles behind the main fight. We just saw intel of a kamikaze drone flying straight down the barrel of a howitzer. That precision matters. You completely neutralize a massive weapon system just by hitting one critical vulnerability dead center. So what do you and I take from this? It vaporizes fire support exactly when the enemy needs it most. Listen closely. We are seeing drone warfare bleed from rear supply routes directly into the heavy systems dictating this kinetic engagement. Any unit starved of ammo, fresh infantry, and artillery cover isn't just taking casualties. They are suffering catastrophic combat erosion. Their tactical ability to stabilize the line degrades totally before the main assault even kicks off. But the sheer scale of this UAV offensive goes way beyond the Lyman sector. Ukrainian forces are now launching interceptor drones to counter heavy Shahed strikes targeting rear echelon civilian grids. We are witnessing the exact same combat tech operating on two distinct fronts. Down in the mud, hunter-killer drones stalk enemy convoys, supply trucks, and heavy armor. Up high, cheap unmanned platforms form a desperate defensive shield against incoming midnight aerial bombardments. Let us analyze this together. It links frontline tactical pressure directly with strategic homeland survival. Ground commanders are being forced to rethink their entire defensive doctrine because the exact same unmanned swarms destroying enemy artillery can simultaneously shield critical power stations and civilian centers. What we are tracking here is definitely not just some scattered string of skirmishes. It is the absolute restructuring of modern warfare by automated systems built to hunt and kill across every single combat tier. When one piece of gear can paralyze enemy armor on the line while guarding the airspace hundreds of miles back, the entire theater of operations stops looking like fractured zones and becomes one unified kill box, dominated completely from above. The Lyman front proves combat is no longer just about who digs their trenches first. Survival now dictates who can detect, isolate, and slaughter the enemy across every single logistics route and firebase. The terrifying reality of this tactical shift is that the threat goes way past losing a single tank today. It chokes off the bloodline of fresh troops, ammunition, and artillery cover, totally fracturing the military machine from within. That is the true, brutal significance of this active engagement. Ukrainian battalions deploy these combat UAVs not merely to kill, but to completely compress the kill zone, erase reaction times, and make survival mathematically impossible during active firefights. If these strikes keep escalating, the critical question around Lyman won't be about holding Russian trenches. It will be how long their forces survive under an airspace that constantly hunts them. That brutal reality defines the sector. Look, combat is never just about territory. It is about a devastating human toll that multiplies every single day this meat grinder spins. You and I track these frontline updates to expose the brutal mechanics of modern warfare, reminding us why peace is vital. Subscribe to Military Force for daily intel, and remember, every blood-soaked lesson learned in the trenches teaches us the absolute value of peace.